There's a moment in every marriage where you think you know the person lying next to you. You've memorized their breathing patterns, the way they take their coffee, the specific sigh they make when they're pretending to listen. Sarah thought she knew Daniel. 15 years of shared meals, shared beds, shared dreams. Then one Tuesday morning, he told her he was leaving everything behind to live in complete silence at a remote monastery. Not leaving her for another woman. Not running from debt or scandal. Leaving their entire life for silence. And here's what nobody tells you about love. Sometimes the most devastating thing isn't betrayal. It's watching someone you love choose a version of truth you can't understand. But this story doesn't end where you think it does. Because 3 years later, Sarah walked through those same monastery gates, not to bring him home, but to join him. If you've ever wondered what love looks like when you strip away every word, every excuse, every noise we use to avoid ourselves, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened inside those walls will change how you think about commitment forever. Daniel wasn't unhappy. That's what made it so much harder. There was no affair, no midlife crisis sports car, no dramatic fight that could explain everything away with neat psychological labels. He was a good husband, attentive, present, the kind of man who still left notes in Sarah's lunch and remembered the anniversary of their first real conversation, not just their wedding. He worked as an architect, designing spaces for other people to live their lives in, coming home each evening to the modest craftsman house they'd restored together. Their life had a rhythm, predictable and comfortable, the kind of existence most people would call blessed. But something was happening to Daniel that he couldn't articulate at dinner tables or during their evening walks. He described it later as a kind of noise that got louder the quieter the world became. Not sound exactly, but a constant static of wanting, planning, defending, explaining. Even in moments of happiness, there was this underlying hum of needing to be somewhere else, someone else, something more. He'd tried meditation apps and therapy and weekend retreats, all the modern solutions to an ancient problem. Nothing touched it. The noise just kept building until he could barely hear his own thoughts beneath the roar of his own mind trying to solve itself. The monastery wasn't something he stumbled upon. It found him the way these things often do, through a book left on a subway seat, a documentary that played while he was falling asleep, a conversation overheard in a coffee shop line. He started researching contemplative traditions, Christian monasticism, the desert fathers who fled civilization for silence in the 4th century. He learned about monks who spent decades in cells barely larger than coffins, not as punishment but as liberation. He read Thomas Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh and a dozen others who all pointed to the same truth, that most human suffering comes from our inability to sit still with ourselves without distraction. When he first mentioned visiting a monastery for a weekend retreat, Sarah encouraged it. She thought he needed a break, maybe some perspective. She didn't realize he was testing a hypothesis about his own soul. He came back different. Not transformed exactly, but quieter in a way that made the house feel louder. He started waking at 4 in the morning to sit in the spare bedroom they'd turned into his office. He stopped scrolling his phone at dinner. He'd pause mid-conversation like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. She asked him if something was wrong. He said no, and it was true. Nothing was wrong. Something was just becoming clear. The actual conversation happened on an ordinary Tuesday. They were eating breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, the morning routine they'd performed thousands of times. Daniel set down his fork and told her he needed to live in a monastery. Not visit. Live. He'd been accepted to a contemplative community in New Mexico that practiced radical silence. Monks there spoke only during weekly meetings and emergency situations. The rest of the time, during meals, work, prayer, the hours between dusk and dawn, nothing but silence. He'd be leaving in 6 weeks. He'd already arranged his resignation at the firm. Sarah's first response was laughter because surely this was some elaborate joke she wasn't getting. But Daniel's face held that same stillness she'd noticed over the past months. Her second response was anger. How could he make this decision without her? How dare he blow up their life for some spiritual fantasy? She said things she'd spend years regretting. Accusations about selfishness and delusion and abandonment. He absorbed it all without defending himself, which somehow made it worse. When she finally exhausted her rage, she asked the only question that mattered. Do you still love me? He said yes immediately. Then why are you leaving? And he said something she couldn't process in that moment, but would replay in her mind 10,000 times. Because I need to learn how to love you without needing you to complete me. They tried therapy. The counselor, a well-meaning woman with advanced degrees and meditation cushions in her office, attempted to frame this as a communication issue, a fear of intimacy, anything that fit conventional psychological models. But Daniel wasn't running from intimacy. He was running toward something Sarah couldn't see, wouldn't see, refused to see. The sessions ended when the therapist gently suggested they might need to accept that people sometimes grow in different directions. Sarah walked out and didn't go back. The 6 weeks passed in a blur of logistics and devastating small talk. They divided their belongings with absurd civility. Daniel kept almost nothing, some clothes, books, a photo of them from their honeymoon in Portugal. He gave her the house, the savings, everything he'd helped build. She didn't want any of it if it came at this price. The night before he left, they lay in bed not touching, both awake, both pretending to sleep. She wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted to scream. She wanted to understand. Instead, she asked if she could write him letters. The monastery allowed correspondence once a month. He said yes. She asked if he'd write back. He said he'd try. The first year after Daniel left was a masterclass in how grief doesn't follow timelines or stages. Sarah went through the motions, work, friends, yoga classes that were supposed to help but just made her angry at her own inflexibility. Everyone had opinions. Her mother said good riddance to a man who'd abandoned his wife for religion. Her best friend suggested dating apps. Her colleagues walked on eggshells, unsure whether to treat her as divorced or widowed or something without a name. She was none of those things and all of them. She was a woman whose husband chose God or silence or himself over their marriage, depending on which narrative felt less devastating on any given day. She wrote Daniel letters every month, long rambling confessions about her anger and confusion, and the specific shade of loneliness that comes from losing someone who's still alive. She told him about the leak in the kitchen sink he would have fixed in 10 minutes, the promotion she got that felt hollow without him to celebrate with, the dreams where he came home and everything returned to normal. His responses came irregularly and were brief, a paragraph, sometimes just a few lines. He wrote about the silence, how it was nothing like he'd imagined. Not peaceful but confrontational. How without words to hide behind, everything he'd been avoiding about himself became unavoidable. He wrote that he prayed for her every morning, and every night. He didn't apologize for leaving. She hated that most of all. But something started shifting in Sarah around month 14. She noticed she was writing to him less about her pain, and more about her questions. What does silence actually do to a person? What are you learning that requires this much sacrifice? Is there really something beyond all the noise we create to avoid ourselves? She started reading the same books Daniel had read, not to understand him, but to understand what he was seeking. She found herself sitting in the spare bedroom he'd used for meditation, just sitting, no apps or guides, feeling ridiculous, and then feeling something beyond ridiculous. A space inside herself she'd been filling with distractions her entire life. She visited the monastery in year 2. She told herself it was closure, a chance to see Daniel face to face and ask him to choose again. The monastery sat in high desert, surrounded by nothing but sage and sky and silence, so profound it felt like a physical presence. She met with Daniel in a small visiting room, a plain space with 2 chairs and a window overlooking the mountains. He looked different, thinner, weathered, somehow more present than she remembered. They had an hour. She'd planned a speech, arguments crafted over months. Instead, she started crying. Not sad tears exactly, but something deeper. All the grief and anger and longing she'd been carrying like stones. He held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. And in that silence, she finally heard it. The thing he'd been trying to tell her all along. That love isn't about completing each other or fixing each other, or even understanding each other. It's about showing up honestly to whatever truth you're living, even when that truth takes you to places the other person can't follow. Sarah went home different. She didn't make any dramatic decisions, didn't quit her job or sell the house, but she started carving out silence in her own life. 5 minutes before work. An hour on Sundays. Eventually entire days where she unplugged everything and sat with whatever came up. It was excruciating at first, like detoxing from a drug she didn't realize she was addicted to. All her anxieties and regrets and fears played in her head like a playlist she couldn't skip. But gradually, underneath all that noise, she found something else. A stillness that wasn't empty but full. A sense of herself that didn't require validation or distraction or Daniel, or anyone else to exist. She started attending silent meditation retreats, 3 days at first, then a week, then longer. She found a contemplative community near her home that met twice weekly. She learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and chosen quiet. She realized Daniel hadn't left her. He'd just gotten to the trailhead first. And the most radical thing was she stopped needing him to come back. She still loved him, maybe more purely than before. But she no longer needed their marriage to look a certain way for her to be whole. Year 3 arrived with unexpected clarity. Sarah applied to the Monastery's associate program, a track for people who wanted to live in intentional community without taking full monastic vows. They accepted her application. She sold the house, quit her job, gave away or donated almost everything she owned. Her mother thought she was having a breakdown. Her friends staged an intervention. But Sarah had never been more certain of anything. This wasn't about chasing Daniel, or trying to win him back, or even about religion exactly. It was about following the same thread of truth he'd followed, seeing where it led. The day she arrived at the monastery, Daniel was working in the garden. She saw him through the window, kneeling in the dirt, his hands deep in soil. He looked up, saw her standing there with her single suitcase, and his face did something she'd never seen before. It broke open. Not crying, but every wall he'd built to survive this sacrifice just crumbling. They stood looking at each other across the garden. And then he went back to his planting because that was the discipline, the practice, the whole point. You don't abandon your work because something beautiful or terrible or miraculous happens. You stay present to what is. Sarah joined the rhythm of monastic life. Waking before dawn for prayers. Working in silence, she was assigned to the library. Eating meals where the only sound was cutlery on plates and the wind outside. It was harder than anything she'd ever done. Every instinct wanted to fill the silence with words, explanations, questions. She wanted to talk to Daniel, really talk, have the conversations they'd never finished. But the silence taught her that talking had never been their problem. They'd talked endlessly, negotiated and compromised and communicated themselves into a life that looked right from the outside, but was slowly suffocating them both. The silence stripped that away, left only what was real. They saw each other every day now, passing in hallways, working in adjacent spaces, sitting in the same chapel for prayers. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and entire conversations would happen in the space between breaths. I see you. I love you. This is hard. This is worth it. Thank you for finding your way here. Thank you for letting me go so I could find mine. All of it without a single word. And Sarah understood finally what Daniel had tried to tell her that Tuesday morning over eggs and toast. Love isn't about holding on. It's about creating enough space for two people to discover who they actually are, and then choosing each other from that truth instead of from fear or habit or need. 5 years into their monastery life, on the rare occasions when speech was permitted, Daniel told Sarah that leaving had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. Not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her too much to keep pretending he could be whole without doing this work. And Sarah told him that his leaving had destroyed her understanding of what love should look like, which turned out to be the greatest gift. It forced her to find a kind of love that didn't require the other person to stay the same, or be available, or even be there at all. A love that could survive silence and distance and complete transformation. Some people who hear their story call it tragic. A couple who couldn't make their marriage work, who needed religion to survive each other. Others call it transcendent. Two souls who loved each other enough to release all their expectations. But Sarah and Daniel don't call it anything. They live it, day by day, in silence and in the occasional permission to speak. They're not technically married anymore in any legal sense. There's something beyond marriage, beneath it, beside it. Two people who found each other, lost each other, and found something more essential in the empty space between words. What they discovered is something most people spend their lives avoiding. That real love, the kind that doesn't break when tested, requires you to become someone worth loving. Not through achievement or perfection, but through the brutal honest work of facing yourself without distraction. The monastery didn't save their relationship. It killed the version of their relationship that was based on need and fear, and the social contract of marriage. What grew in its place was wilder, stranger, more durable than anything they could have built through couples therapy or date nights or trying harder. On their 10th anniversary of Daniel's departure, which also marks Sarah's 7th year at the monastery, they take a walk together during the permitted recreation hour. The desert stretches around them, all red rock and impossible sky. They don't hold hands because physical touch between members is discouraged. They don't talk because words still feel inadequate compared to the language they've learned in silence. But they walk side by side, two people who loved each other enough to completely destroy their lives and build something entirely different from the ruins. And if you ask Sarah whether she regrets any of it, the pain, the years of separation, the family who thinks she's lost her mind, she'd tell you that regret is just another form of noise. What she has now is clarity. What they have now is real. If this story challenged something in you about what commitment actually means, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe if you want more stories that go where most people are afraid to look. And remember, sometimes the most profound act of love is giving someone permission to leave, so you both can finally arrive.